I never thought I'd be the one to tell this story. The only one left to tell it. For months, I've debated whether to share what happened in that godforsaken place. Every time I close my eyes, I see the black sand, feel it creeping up my legs. But I have to share what we found out there, in case it happens again. My name's Danakil. I was, and still am, an archaeological researcher specializing in ancient African civilizations. Last year, I was part of a team that made what we thought was the discovery of a lifetime. Instead, it turned out to be a nightmare that only I survived. The Danakil Depression in Ethiopia is already an alien landscape. It's one of the lowest, hottest, and most inhospitable places on Earth. The ground is a patchwork of salt flats, acid pools, and volcanic rock that stretches as far as the eye can see. The air itself feels hostile, thick with sulfur and heat that can reach 125 degrees in the shade. Local Afar people call it the gateway to hell. They're not wrong. Our team arrived in early October, when the temperatures were somewhat bearable. Dr. Elias Kane, our lead researcher, had gotten a tip from a local guide about unusual formations in an unexplored section of the depression. Kane was brilliant but ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. He'd been passed over for tenure twice, and you could tell this expedition was his last shot at academic glory. The team was small but skilled. Jennifer, our linguist, spoke 7 languages and had a particular expertise in ancient Ethiopian dialects. Victor was our historian, with 3 published books on African civilizations. Jamal, our local guide, had grown up in the region and knew the depression better than anyone. Then there were the grad students, Lisa and Mike, both eager to prove themselves. We spotted the pyramid on our 4th day of exploration. It was nothing like the others documented in Ethiopia. While most ancient pyramids in the region are tall, steep-sided structures, this one was smaller, squatter, almost as if it was trying to hide in the landscape. The stone was a deep, almost metallic black that seemed to absorb the sunlight, but it was the carvings that first set off my internal alarms. They covered every visible surface, depicting scenes of human figures in poses of supplication or terror, their faces elongated in expressions of fear or pain. The imagery was unsettling, to say the least, and unlike any iconography I had encountered before. Jennifer said they didn't match any known ancient Ethiopian script, though some symbols seemed vaguely familiar to her. Kane was ecstatic. He spent that first evening taking hundreds of photos, his hands shaking with excitement as he uploaded them to his laptop. That's when he made the first mistake. In his longing to stake his claim, he posted about our discovery on a private dark web forum for archaeologists. It was a place where researchers sometimes shared preliminary findings or discussed potentially controversial discoveries, away from public scrutiny. The responses came almost immediately. Not congratulations or scholarly interest, but warnings. Dark, cryptic messages that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One user wrote, "The Black Pyramid must remain buried. The sand hungers still." Another simply posted, "You've awakened them. Run." Most disturbing was a message from someone claiming to be a former researcher who'd found the same pyramid 30 years ago. The entire team had vanished, he said, except for him. He described sand black as the night, and something about hooded figures moving in the darkness. Kane dismissed it as academic jealousy or local superstition, but I noticed how his hands trembled as he closed his laptop. We set up camp about 100 yards from the pyramid. Looking back, that was our second mistake. We should have stayed farther away, but Kane insisted on being close to the site. The first night, none of us slept well. I remember waking up around 3 a.m. that first night, needing to use the bathroom. As I stepped out of my tent, I saw Kane standing alone by the pyramid, his flashlight beam playing across the carvings. He was muttering to himself, reaching out to touch the stone surface. When I called out to him, he jumped like he'd been shocked. The next morning, he claimed he had no memory of being there. The local Afar people refused to come near our camp. Jamal tried to convince some of them to work as laborers, but they would just shake their heads and make signs to ward off evil. One old man grabbed Jamal's arm and spoke to him urgently in their local dialect. When I asked Jamal what the man had said, he just shook his head and mumbled something about the hungry ones and those who feed the sand. We should have listened. We should have packed up right then and left that cursed place to its secrets. But Cain was insistent, and the rest of us were too invested, too curious, too proud to walk away from what could be the archaeological discovery of the century. Jennifer started working on translating the carvings, spending hours photographing and sketching them. She said there was something unusual about the way the symbols were arranged, like they weren't meant to be read in any normal direction. Sometimes she would stop suddenly in her work, staring at her notes with a troubled expression, then furiously cross out everything she'd written. Victor began researching local histories, trying to find any mention of the pyramid in ancient texts or oral traditions. He became increasingly agitated as he discovered that every reference to this region from certain time periods seemed to have been deliberately destroyed or redacted. It was as if someone had systematically erased all record of whatever happened here. The grad students, Lisa and Mike, were the only ones who seemed genuinely excited still. They would chatter away during meals about the papers they could write and the conferences they could speak at. Their enthusiasm felt increasingly out of place as the rest of us grew more uneasy. Looking back, their ignorance might have been a blessing. They couldn't sense what was coming. That first week, we focused on documenting the exterior of the pyramid and preparing for a proper excavation. Cain was pushing hard to get inside, but proper protocols had to be followed and permits had to be obtained. At least that's what we told ourselves. I think deep down we were all grateful for the delay. There was something about the idea of opening that structure that filled us with instinctive dread. The forum warnings continued, becoming more urgent. Users we'd never seen before created accounts just to tell us to leave. One user posted a series of coordinates that, when mapped, showed the locations of other archaeological teams that had vanished in Ethiopia over the past century. Cain's behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped sleeping almost entirely, spending his nights huddled over his laptop, scrolling through the forum posts. During the day, he would stand for hours staring at the pyramid, muttering equations and measurements under his breath. When I suggested we might want to bring in more experts before proceeding, he exploded in rage, accusing me of trying to steal his discovery. The nightmares started that first week too. We all had them, though no one wanted to talk about them at first. Dreams of black sand moving like water and hooded figures performing horrifying rituals. Looking back at my journal entries from those first days, I can see how things were already unraveling. How the horror was creeping in slowly, like sand through an hourglass. We were so focused on the academic significance of our find that we missed all the warning signs. If only we had left then. If only we had listened to the warnings, packed up our equipment, and walked away. But we didn't. And now I'm the only one left to tell this story, to warn others about what waits in that black pyramid under the Ethiopian sun. Because what we found in that pyramid wasn't just an archaeological discovery. The second week at the site started with a discovery that should have made us leave immediately. During our morning survey, Jennifer found a series of carvings near the base of the pyramid that were different from the others. While most of the imagery depicted human figures in various poses of worship or terror, these showed something more specific. detailed scenes of ritual sacrifice. The carvings were crude but unmistakable. They showed lines of people being led into the pyramid's entrance, but none coming out. Instead, the scenes depicted them descending into what appeared to be chambers, filled with dark waves or ripples. Jennifer spent hours photographing and sketching these panels, growing more disturbed with each translation attempt. One evening, she mentioned that the inscriptions repeatedly referred to the sands of hunger. She pointed out a recurring phrase, "The sand demands its tribute," and noted that the grammar was unusual, portraying the sand as if it were a living entity rather than an inanimate substance. The black sand was becoming a constant presence in our camp. At first, we found it in logical places, scattered across our equipment, blown into the corners of tents, collecting in our boot treads. But then it started appearing in sealed containers. I found a layer of it coating my laptop keyboard one morning, though my tent had been zipped tight all night. Lisa reported finding it in her sealed water bottle. Jamal became increasingly agitated about the sand. He told us stories he'd heard from his grandmother about this region, tales of entire caravans disappearing in the night, leaving nothing behind but trails of black sand. The local tribes had apparently avoided this area for centuries, believing it to be cursed ground where the earth itself hungered for human life. Kane dismissed these stories as superstition, but I noticed he'd stopped sleeping in his tent. He spent his nights in the makeshift lab we'd set up, obsessively reviewing the forum posts and examining sand samples under our portable microscope. The bags under his eyes grew darker, and his hands developed a constant tremor. Our initial geological analysis of the sand yielded puzzling results. Its composition didn't match any local formations. In fact, it didn't match any known mineral profile in our database. Under the microscope, the grains showed unusual crystalline structures that seemed to shift and realign themselves when left undisturbed. Victor suggested sending samples to a lab in Addis Ababa for more detailed analysis, but Kane refused, insisting we keep everything on site. The atmosphere in camp grew heavier with each passing day. The usual camaraderie of an archaeological expedition gave way to tense silences and nervous glances. We'd catch each other staring at the pyramid for long periods, lost in thought. Even the grad students' enthusiasm began to wane, especially after Mike found his camera's memory card completely corrupted, despite being brand new. The dark web forum continued to flood with warnings. One user, claiming to be a geologist who had studied similar sand samples from another site, wrote detailed posts about its unusual properties. They described how the sand seemed to multiply overnight, appearing in sealed containers and spreading through seemingly impossible spaces. We began finding strange formations in the sand around the pyramid each morning, perfect circles, geometric patterns, and what looked like writing in scripts none of us recognized. When we photographed these formations, the images would come out blurry or distorted, no matter how many times we tried to capture them. The dreams grew worse. Jennifer started sleepwalking, and twice we found her standing at the pyramid's base in the middle of the night, her hands pressed against the stone, mumbling in what sounded like ancient Ethiopian dialects. When we led her back to her tent, she had no memory of these episodes the next morning. Victor spent countless hours in his tent, poring over historical records and local legends. He managed to find scattered references to a cult that had operated in the region thousands of years ago. They supposedly practiced human sacrifice, believing that feeding victims to the living sands would grant them power and immortality. Most academics had dismissed these accounts as myths, but sitting there in the shadow of that black pyramid, they felt uncomfortably real. The local Afar people's refusal to approach our site took on new significance when we discovered ancient warning markers, half buried in the sand several hundred yards from the pyramid. These stone pillars were carved with symbols that Jennifer said translated roughly to forbidden ground and place of hunger. Carbon dating of similar markers found in the region suggested they were over 3,000 years old. Kane's obsession with the pyramid grew more intense. He began talking about hearing voices at night that seemed to emanate from the structure itself. During one particularly heated argument, he admitted to receiving private messages on the forum from someone claiming to be part of the ancient cult. Someone who promised to teach him their secrets if he performed certain rituals. The breaking point came when we started finding traces of blood in the sand. Small amounts at first, just drops here and there, easily dismissed as someone's nosebleed or minor cut. But then we discovered larger patches, and none of us could account for their source. The blood always appeared in the morning, accompanied by new patterns in the black sand. Our satellite phone started malfunctioning. The few times we managed to get a clear signal to call for supplies or check in with our universities, the connections would break as soon as we mentioned the pyramid or our discoveries. Lisa was the first to voice what we were all thinking. During dinner one night, she suggested that maybe the warnings were right. Maybe we should leave before things got worse. Kane exploded in anger, accusing her of cowardice and threatening to revoke her graduate position if she continued to spread fear among the team. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself reviewing my journal entries, trying to make sense of everything we'd experienced. The rational part of my mind struggled to explain it all. The sand's impossible behavior, the blood, the dreams, the growing sense of malevolence that seemed to emanate from the pyramid. Looking back, I can see how we rationalized each strange occurrence, each warning sign. We were scientists, trained to seek logical explanations and dismiss supernatural possibilities. But science couldn't explain what was happening to us. It couldn't explain the shared dreams we had, why the black sand seemed to follow us, or why our equipment kept failing. The next morning, everything changed. We woke to find Lisa's tent empty, with a trail of black sand leading to the pyramid's entrance. That's when we realized the warnings had been right all along. That's when the true horror began. The morning we discovered Lisa's empty tent was a turning point. There was no sign of struggle, no cries in the night, just an unzipped tent flap swaying gently in the early breeze. Her sleeping bag lay crumpled, as though hastily abandoned, and her belongings were neatly arranged, as though she'd intended to return at any moment. The realization came slowly as we stood there, stunned. A trail of footprints led away from her tent, barely visible in the shifting sand, heading directly toward the pyramid. We followed them, our hearts pounding with each step that took us closer to the foreboding structure. But as we neared the pyramid's entrance, the tracks seemed to vanish, swallowed by the endlessly moving desert floor. Kane was the first to break the silence. Instead of alarm, his voice was tinged with excitement. This could be part of the ritual, he muttered more to himself than to us. An invitation to uncover the truth. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. Jennifer looked pale, clutching Lisa's notebook, which was left open on the ground. The pages were filled with her meticulous notes on the carvings, a testament to her dedication, and now a chilling reminder of her absence. Our attempts to call for help were met with frustration. Victor, who had immediately tried the satellite phone, found it plagued with interference, the line crackling with static before cutting off entirely. Our radios were no better, picking up nothing but faint echoes that seemed to mimic our own voices. In the hours that followed, the camp descended into a tense silence. Jennifer and Victor, both visibly shaken, tried to retrace Lisa's last known movements, piecing together her final hours from the scattered remnants of her notes. I joined them, hoping to find some clue, some indication of where she might have gone or why. Jamal, on the other hand, was adamant about leaving. He had seen enough and wanted no part in whatever was unfolding at the pyramid. "The desert takes what it wants," he said, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. "We should never have come here." Cain, however, was unwilling to entertain the idea of leaving. He was convinced that the pyramid held answers, not just to Lisa's disappearance, but to the mysteries that had drawn us here in the first place. His obsession with the site seemed to deepen with each passing hour, blinding him to the growing danger. As the sun began its relentless descent, casting long shadows across our camp, we gathered to discuss our next steps. The conversation was strained, voices raised in frustration and fear. Victor and I argued for a full-scale search, while Jennifer insisted on contacting local authorities, despite the risk of exposing our unsanctioned dig. Cain dismissed our concerns, instead proposing we conduct a thorough exploration of the pyramid's interior. He argued that Lisa might have found a way inside, lured by the same whispers of discovery that had captivated us all. His logic, though flawed, was difficult to refute. After all, where else could she have gone? The decision weighed heavily on us all, but as night fell, it became clear that we had little choice. We agreed to wait until morning, when the light would be on our side, and prepare to enter the pyramid, driven by a desperate hope of finding Lisa safe and sound. That night, we couldn't sleep. We huddled together in the common tent, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional rustle of the desert wind. Each of us was lost in our thoughts, grappling with the unsettling reality of our situation. In the early hours, a faint sound reached us, a rhythmic thumping like the distant beat of a drum. It seemed to come from the direction of the pyramid, growing louder and more insistent as the night wore on. We exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to investigate or ignore it altogether. When dawn finally broke, the sound ceased as abruptly as it had started, leaving us with an eerie sense of foreboding. We emerged from the tent, exhausted but resolute, determined to uncover the truth of what had transpired. As we approached the pyramid's entrance, the sense of unease grew stronger. The air felt tense, as if expecting us to disturb it. Cain led the way, his movements brisk and purposeful, fueled by an urgency none of us could understand. Inside, the air was cool and still, a stark contrast to the relentless heat outside. Our flashlights flickered over the stone walls, revealing carvings that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. The passages were narrow and claustrophobic, twisting deeper into the earth with each step we took. We searched for hours, calling Lisa's name, our voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. But the deeper we went, the more it felt like the pyramid itself was closing in around us, its ancient walls pressing against our senses. It was Jennifer who found the altar room, her flashlight beam catching on the stone surface, slick with something dark and sticky. She recoiled, her breath catching in her throat, and we rushed to her side, our collective fear mounting. The altar was empty, but the implications were clear. We stood there, a group of rational minds confronted with the inexplicable, our resolve crumbling under the weight of what we couldn't explain. Cain, however, seemed energized by the discovery. "This is it," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with a look that was deeply unsettling. "This is what we've been searching for." But as he spoke, I felt a sense that we were being watched, that the shadows around us were not as empty as they seemed. The reality of our situation crashed over me, leaving me breathless with a terror I couldn't shake. We left the pyramid in silence, our minds reeling from the implications of what we had seen. As we emerged into the harsh light of day, the desert stretched out before us, vast and indifferent, a reminder of how small and insignificant we truly were. The truth was undeniable now. Lisa was gone, swallowed by a mystery that defied logic and reason. The day after our initial exploration of the pyramid's interior, the atmosphere in camp shifted from fear to a suffocating paranoia. Our satellite phone had stopped working completely, not just interference now, but dead silence. The nearest town was a 2-day journey across the depression, and our water supplies were running low. Kane had insisted we conserve fuel for the generator, leaving us in darkness for longer periods each night. Victor's behavior changed dramatically after what we'd found in the altar room. The dark substance we'd discovered, which lab analysis later confirmed was dried blood, had shaken him to his core. He spent hours poring over his research materials, connecting historical dots we'd previously missed. "Look at this," he said one evening, spreading out several printouts with trembling hands. "There are records of disappearances in this region going back centuries, not just random vanishings, organized patterns. Every few decades, groups of people would go missing, always near this location. The local authorities blamed it on bandits or sandstorms, but the timing, it's too precise to be coincidental." Jennifer had made progress translating more of the hieroglyphs inside the pyramid. The stories they told were disturbing, accounts of an ancient sect that had splintered from mainstream Ethiopian Christianity, mixing Orthodox practices with something much older and darker. "They'd chosen this location for a reason," she explained. "The depression's extreme conditions provided perfect isolation for their rituals." "These aren't just historical records, they're instructions," she said. "This pyramid, it wasn't built as a tomb, it's a temple. Or maybe something worse." Kane dismissed our concerns with increasing hostility. He'd set up a permanent workspace inside the pyramid's entrance chamber, claiming the generator power was better used for his research than for our comfort at night. We could hear him talking to himself sometimes, recording notes into his dictaphone in a mixture of English and attempted ancient Ethiopian dialects. The dark web forum had gone quiet, but Kane had downloaded dozens of posts and messages. I found him one night, hunched over his laptop, cross-referencing the posts with his own notes. The users had described precise locations within the pyramid, chambers we hadn't yet found, and rituals that corresponded exactly with the hieroglyphs Jennifer was translating. Our supplies continued to dwindle. Jamal made an attempt to reach the nearest settlement for help, but returned after 6 hours, looking shaken. He claimed he'd gotten turned around in the depression's monotonous landscape, ending up back near the pyramid despite walking in what he thought was a straight line. His GPS unit had malfunctioned, showing coordinates that jumped erratically across the map. The night sounds grew worse. The rhythmic thumping we'd heard before became a regular occurrence, always starting around 3 a.m. We tried to trace its source, but the acoustics of the depression played tricks with our ears. Sometimes it seemed to come from the pyramid, other times from the surrounding desert, as if multiple groups were coordinating their movements. One morning, we found fresh tire tracks about a mile from camp. Heavy vehicles, military or commercial grade. But they simply ended abruptly, as if the vehicles had vanished into thin air. When we followed them back in the opposite direction, they led nowhere, disappearing into the endless desert. The real breaking point came when we discovered Victor's research tent had been ransacked. Pages were torn from his notebooks, and his laptop was missing. But the strangest part was that our perimeter alarm hadn't been triggered, and there were no footprints in the sand around the tent except our own. Kane suggested we do another, more thorough exploration of the pyramid's interior. There have to be other chambers, he insisted. The forum posts mentioned a lower level. If Lisa found a way down there. We argued about it for hours. Jennifer and I wanted to abandon the site immediately, but Kane reminded us that without his vehicle's keys, which he'd hidden somewhere, we'd never make it across the depression alive. The argument ended when we heard a sound from the pyramid that turned our blood cold. Lisa's voice, calling for help. This time, it wasn't just one person who heard it, we all did, clear as day, coming from somewhere deep within the structure. Victor was the first to react, grabbing a flashlight and running toward the entrance. The rest of us followed, our fear of losing another colleague overwhelming our better judgment. The pyramid's interior felt different this time. The air was thicker, harder to breathe. Our flashlight beams seemed weaker, barely penetrating the darkness ahead. Kane led us down passages we hadn't explored before, consulting a hand-drawn map that matched markings on the walls. The deeper we went, the more the temperature dropped. The walls were slick with condensation, which made no sense given the desert heat above. The hieroglyphs here were different too, cruder, older looking. We found a narrow staircase, ancient steps worn smooth by countless feet. It spiraled down into darkness, the air growing colder with each turn. The sound of Lisa's voice grew stronger, mixing with what seemed to be other voices, all calling out in different languages. That's when we lost Victor. One moment he was right behind me, and the next, nothing. No sound, no cry for help, just the empty space where a person used to be. Kane wanted to press on, but Jennifer and I grabbed him and forced him back up the stairs. We could hear footsteps following us, but they weren't Victor's. They were too heavy, too deliberate. We emerged into the desert night, gasping for air, our flashlights nearly dead. The stars above seemed wrong somehow, as if they'd shifted while we were below. Back at camp, we found Jamal loading his truck with supplies. He'd heard something while we were gone. Voices speaking in his native language, telling him to leave immediately. But it wasn't the voices that had scared him. It was the fact that he recognized them. They belonged to people he knew had died years ago. Kane locked himself in his tent, refusing to speak to any of us. Jennifer worked through the night, transcribing and translating the symbols we'd seen below. When dawn came, she showed us her work, her hands shaking as she laid out the papers. What she discovered would change everything we thought we knew about the pyramid, about Lisa's disappearance, and about the true nature of that ancient place. But the real horror was still to come, and it would arrive with the next sunset. The events of our last night at the pyramid site still haunt me. I've replayed them countless times, trying to understand how I alone walked away from that place. The guilt of survival weighs heavy, especially knowing I could have done more to save the others. That morning started with Jennifer's translations. Her hands trembled as she spread her notes across our makeshift table, pointing to specific hieroglyphs she'd documented from the lower chamber. These aren't just historical records, she explained. They're a manual. The pyramid was designed for human sacrifice. A way for the ancient cult to maintain their power over the local population. Always 4 sacrifices per night. Kane's reaction was disturbing. Instead of horror, his eyes lit up with academic interest. He began comparing Jennifer's translations to the messages he'd archived from the dark web forum. The similarities were undeniable. Whoever had been posting knew exactly what this place was designed for. Around midday, we heard vehicles approaching. Through our binoculars, we spotted 3 trucks moving across the depression. Kane's face went pale. He admitted that he'd been in contact with someone through the forum who'd promised to help complete the ritual. He'd given them our coordinates. They said they'd help us understand everything, he stammered. They promised to share their knowledge if we helped continue the tradition. Jamal immediately started packing his truck, insisting we leave before the vehicles arrived. But Cain had tampered with the fuel lines during the night. We were trapped. The trucks arrived just before sunset. Men in dark clothes emerged, their faces hidden under traditional Ethiopian head wrappings. They carried modern weapons but wore ancient amulets. This wasn't some historical reenactment. This was an active cult that had maintained its practices for centuries. Everything happened too fast after that. They surrounded our camp with practiced efficiency. Jennifer tried to run but didn't make it far. I watched helplessly as they dragged her toward the pyramid, her screams echoing across the depression. Cain just stood there, nodding as if this was all part of some grand academic exercise. Jamal fought back when they came for him. He managed to take down 2 of them before a gun blast echoed across the camp. They carried his body into the pyramid anyway. Cain's realization came too late. As the cult members approached him, his academic detachment finally shattered. The look of pure terror on his face will stay with me forever when he understood that he wasn't their ally, but their final sacrifice. I survived through pure luck and desperation. While they were occupied with Cain, I managed to slip away in the chaos. I remembered Jamal mentioning an old shepherd's path that led out of the depression. I ran through the night, using the stars for navigation as he had taught us. Behind me, I could hear the rhythmic chanting emanating from the pyramid, growing fainter as I put distance between myself and that cursed place. The cult didn't pursue me. Perhaps they had what they needed. I don't know. I ran the whole night before reaching a small village. The local people took one look at me and knew where I'd come from. They've seen others like me before, the ones who escaped the pyramid. The authorities claimed they couldn't find any trace of our camp or equipment. Their behavior was strange, as if they knew more than they were letting on. I couldn't tell if they were incompetent, unwilling to help, or perhaps even working with the cult. Sometimes I dream about the others. Lisa's determination, Victor's curiosity, Jennifer's intelligence, Jamal's courage, even Cain's misguided passion. They deserved better than to become entries in the pyramid's long history of sacrifice. Sharing this account isn't just about warning others. It's my attempt to honor my colleagues, to ensure their deaths weren't completely meaningless. And perhaps by exposing this horror to the light of day, I can help prevent future expeditions from falling into the same trap. So if you ever receive an invitation to explore an undocumented pyramid in the Danakil Depression, remember what happened to us. Some discoveries aren't worth the cost. Some secrets should remain buried in the desert sand. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you want more tales like this, hit like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.